Dan Goes to Kindergarten by Gila Fleisher, illustrated by Mike Eagle. This is the front cover of the book, the spine of the book, and the back of the book. Dan Goes to Kindergarten by Gila Fleisher, the author, illustrated by Mike Eagle, who drew the pictures. This is the title page, Dan Goes to Kindergarten. Early one morning, Dan jumped up out of bed, ran to his mother and said, Mom, get up. I'm starting kindergarten today. Mom looked at the clock and said, Don't worry, Dan. It's only 5 o'clock in the morning. Go back to bed. But I can't sleep, said Dan. It was still dark outside, so Dan went back to bed. He tossed and turned for what felt like a long time. Then he thought, I know, I'll make sure I have everything ready for school. Dan got out his special backpack. He took out the pink eraser, the big pencil, and the crayons. He looked at them and thought, I wish I were already on my way to school. Then he put everything back into the backpack and got dressed. He put on his best jeans and t-shirt. Then he put on clean socks and his brand new sneakers. Last of all, he put the backpack on his back, stood in front of the mirror and thought, now I look big and grown up. I am ready for kindergarten. Finally, Mom was ready too. They ate breakfast together and left for school. When they arrived, the schoolyard was crowded and noisy. Children waved and called to each other, and parents talked among themselves. Dan knew that Miss Johnson would be his teacher. A few days earlier, he had gone to the school and met her. She said that on the first day of school, she would wait for the children at the classroom door. Dan already knew which way to go. Miss Johnson walked up to him and said, Good morning. You probably remember that my name is Miss Johnson. Dan nodded his head. Tell me your name again. Dan. That's a nice name, said Miss Johnson. Welcome to kindergarten. Meanwhile, the children had begun to line up in the hallway. Dan was worried. Who will be my partner? He wondered. Suddenly, he saw Bobby from his playgroup. Where have you been? Asked Bobby. I've been looking for you. Dan and Bobby joined the other children. Then Miss Johnson told the children to follow her and asked the parents to leave. Mom gave Dan a hug and a kiss and smiled. Have a good day, she said. Dan waved goodbye and suddenly he left the line, ran over to Miss Johnson and said excitedly, Miss Johnson, I want to go home. Why on earth do you want to go home? Asked Miss Johnson in surprise. I know all the letters, said Dan quickly, and I can count up to 100 and I can even add. So now I want to go home, please. Even though Dan was trying hard not to cry, he felt a little tear in the corner of his eye. Miss Johnson leaned down and whispered something in Dan's ear. Dan listened, and the look on his face quickly changed. He even smiled and then hurried back to line. When Mom picked Dan up after work, she asked, Well, how did it go? How do you like kindergarten? It's great, Dan answered as they walked along. He told her about eating lunch in the big lunchroom, and about 2 of his new friends, Louis and Nancy, and about the games they played at recess, and about the story Miss Johnson had read them. And Dan talked and talked on and on all the way home. When they got home, Mom said, Dan, I'm so glad that you're so happy in school. You know, Mom, Dan said in a very serious voice. At first, I almost cried. I told the teacher that I already knew letters and numbers and that I wanted to go home. What made you change your mind? Mom asked. Miss Johnson needed my help, Dan answered. She whispered to me, Dan, I wonder if you are a little bit scared. I am. This is the first time I have ever taught kindergarten, and everything is new to me. But now I have you to help me because you can count. Come on, let's count together how many children are in the class. Mom, I have to go to school early tomorrow. Miss Johnson will probably want me to help her again. I'm so proud of you, Mom said with a big hug for Dan. I'm glad you could help your teacher. She squeezed him tighter. But don't get up too early tomorrow, she said, and they both laughed.